My friends, let us consider that acuity is the refined clarity of thought and perception which enables one to discern subtle truths.
Hey everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Acuity podcast. As always, Acuity is best savored over an indulgent and stimulating caffeinated drink. So grab your favorite fix, a steaming cup of coffee, a refreshing Diet Coke, a soothing tea, or prepare to get sweaty with a pre-workout, and let's get started. On the agenda this week, we will be discussing political advocacy, what I'm up to from legal cases against the Canadian federal government and the province of Nova Scotia, before I do a deeper dive on birth injuries. To begin, I want to talk a little bit about my politics. The left and right divide doesn't seem to fit anymore. I prefer to think about the political spectrum as just that, a spectrum, of big government involvement to no government involvement. There are some issues in which a larger role from government makes sense, in essence, a more socialist model for managing a problem, and some in which a much more libertarian perspective makes sense. And then there's everything in between. The level of government also makes a difference, where federal response might make more sense for some cases and less sense over favoring a municipal response. I don't want to suggest that I am some brilliant political scientist or economist. Instead, I want to highlight some of the perspectives on this subject from my favorite academics that I have found not only to be the most erudite, the most intelligent, but also the most persuasive. Firstly, John Locke. He was an incredible political philosopher who was a major inspiration to the American ideas of governance. He wrote his second treatise in the late 17th century. He famously discusses natural rights and the role of government in society. That is to say that citizens purposefully sacrifice some autonomy through a social contract to an accountable government operating with checks and balances. The government's responsibility is the protection and promotion of those natural rights, specifically life, liberty, and property. They're called natural rights because they belong to us inherently as human beings. Next up is John Stuart Mill, one of the greatest political minds of all time, whose essay on liberty from 1859 is an incredible read. I read it at least once a year. In fact, I love reading it to my children, mostly before they can really understand what I'm saying, but the language is rich and it's very persuasive. He argues brilliantly from a utilitarian perspective about the government's role being limited to only preventing harm between people in society, with very limited intervention in some other arenas like education, to make sure people have the opportunity to realize their own individual potential. Even in those situations, he strongly advocates that the smallest government presence necessary is sufficient, and even that only when it's involved at all. He did not do this from a deontological position, that is like John Locke. He was not arguing about absolute moral benefits and virtues, much more from a net value in society flourishing. Next, I want to move into the more modern era. Milton Friedman. You can still watch many of his lectures online on YouTube, and he has an incredibly charming way of lecturing, let alone that the substance of his lectures has earned him a place in history. He is a profound economist. He has examined in great detail how and where government intervention has succeeded. Unsurprisingly, almost nowhere. Almost everywhere that government intercedes, outcomes worsen. He highlights that the government should protect against coercion through the enforcement of contracts, national defense and law and order, so that free markets with rational actors, even greedy ones, can be left to flourish independently. He predicted the potential for massive oligarchs intervening in government and having a much greater level of control in the populace, but he did feel that this was always more preferable than the tyranny of big government itself. His book, Capitalism and Freedom, is very readable, very enjoyable, and compelling. Here, I also have to give a special shout out to Thomas Sowell, another brilliant, still living economist at the age of 94, who advanced the same perspectives as Milton Friedman. There are many lectures and interviews online of Thomas Sowell, but his book, which I warn you is very dense, Intellectuals and Society, is an absolute masterwork in undermining modern technocracies, where elitist experts are held as paragons of stewardship in society. Instead, he describes the history of central planning failures, how things like the WHO, the UN, the EU, the WEF, with other international institutions, are detrimental to the flourishing of society. He spells out in great detail, with many examples, about how these errors occur and how prevalent they are in our world. Now, that brings me to my individual politics. In my estimation, the individual matters tremendously, more specifically, the family unit. Large-scale collective decision-making is far too often harmful to society outside of very specific situations, such as the military, policing, a judiciary for contract dispute, and a clean environment. Not the hysteria of the Green Revolution and associated climate alarmism. Things like agriculture, commerce, education, energy, housing and urban development, labor, transportation, and even most of healthcare, all of that should be given to the responsibility of the individuals and not under government oversight. So what am I doing about it? I want to give you some insight to my nonprofit organization, the Nova Scotia Civil Liberties Association, where we advance individual civil liberties. We do advocacy work for people against their employers and against the government, where we see intrusions against what people should have the sole control over, most notably free speech and medical autonomy, such as vaccine mandates. The Nova Scotia Civil Liberties Association is currently in action against the province of Nova Scotia for new legislation permitting the Minister of Health to look at individuals' medical records. We are in early days of the action, but the theory goes that the government should not have the prerogative to invade an individual's medical file because it does not have any relevance. Instead, it poses a large risk to tyranny. Imagine I applied to become the head of a government service, for example, running a hospital. The Minister of Health has a quick look at my medical record, sees my vaccination history, my psychiatric history, or even my sexual history, and deems me inappropriate. That is a scandalous possibility. Note that, even though I would most identify strongly as a conservative politically, this action is being taken against the conservative government. There is no monopoly on the threat of tyranny from the left nor the right, and defending against the encroachment of government, an ever-present and growing institution that never relinquishes power in favor of the individual, is forever a battle that we have to fight. Speaking of ever-growing government and their authority, I want to harken back to the checks and balances that we should be expecting. I am also currently an applicant in a lawsuit against the Trudeau government for proroguing government, unnecessarily for partisan purposes. Shutting down Parliament when a government is held accountable by an opposition with rules of transparency should only happen under the strictest conditions. Given the multiple international conflicts that Canada is participating in and the tariff war with the US, this is a critical time for a functioning Parliament. Hiding behind prorogation is avoiding the checks and balances that our Constitution has laid out, that has helped Canada become the great country that it is. In addition, what is the net benefit of the prorogation? Trudeau has had his own cabinet ministers revolt against him, he has semi-resigned, and the only major benefit or purpose that he has outlined is to be able to put the Liberal Party in order. That is insufficient cause to stop the functioning of government. Currently, he and his cabinet have executive meetings, they come together with plans, they're trying to fight against the US and Trumpism with respect to these tariffs, but we are missing the rest of the parliamentary procedure that the electorate has come to expect. So, to wrap this up, there are always battles to fight in the preservation of our individual liberties, and those liberties matter not only because they are absolute principles of morality, but also because they are predicate for societal flourishing. Free markets with independent actors seeking their own best interests has been the greatest force for human flourishing that the world has ever seen. Wherever we see tyrannies forming and denying these rights, such as Maoist China, Stalinist Russia, Castro's Cuba, we see suffering. But we need not look at such huge examples. Public healthcare in Canada is collapsing. Subsidized universities bloat and their education standards fall. Dairy prices in Canada are inflated by protectionism. Central city planning leads to disastrous housing prices. The evidence of failures of elitist central planners are abundant. You need only look around. Concluding the first part of the podcast, next up, we explore a subject that touches the heart of many families: birth injuries. As both a physician and attorney, my mission is to educate on the complexities of pregnancy, labor, and delivery, focusing on the devastating outcomes that can come from them, like cerebral palsy, developmental delays, and seizure disorders, often due to hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, or more simply, oxygen-deprived brain damage. I'll also highlight where medical errors can occur, potentially leading to malpractice cases. Birth injuries are not just medical events. They're life-altering for the newborns and their families. These brain injuries occur when there's a significant reduction in oxygen or blood flow to the brain, typically during the labor process. This oxygen deprivation leads to neuronal death, potentially causing cerebral palsy, like permanent movement disorders affecting motor control and coordination, or cognitive issues such as developmental delays and the failure to reach milestones, or seizure disorders resulting from damage to areas of the brain responsible for regulating electrical activity, leading to debilitating forms of epilepsy. Let's delve into the physiology of labor. The process is a careful dance of contractions, cervical dilation, and fetal descent. However, complications like prolonged labor, placental abruption, or umbilical cord issues can reduce oxygen supply to the fetus. This results in that ischemia and brain cell death. Before we get to the actual labor component, it's worth talking about proper prenatal care. Prenatal care is an essential journey that begins with the confirmation of pregnancy and extends through to delivery. This involves comprehensive maternal health checks and ultrasound surveillance to identify risk factors and medical conditions early. Failure to identify and manage those risk factors, such as gestational diabetes, placental insufficiency, risk for medications and substances, or uncontrolled hypertension and preeclampsia, can lead to adverse outcomes. An attorney would look into whether there was negligence in the identification, monitoring, or treatment of those various conditions. Next, labor and delivery. Labor and delivery mark the climax of the prenatal journey, where the focus shifts to the active management of childbirth. This process typically begins with the onset of labor, characterized by regular uterine contractions, cervical dilatation, and effacement of the cervix, which is the thinning of the cervix, the rupture of membranes, and, obviously, the expelling of the amniotic fluid. This leads to the descent of the fetus through the birth canal. During this time, healthcare providers assess the progress through serial examinations, the monitoring of fetal heart rate, the strength and timing of contractions, and the maternal vital signs, to ensure both the mother and the baby are coping well. Pain management options like epidurals are discussed, and interventions like induction or assistance with labor progression with oxytocin, a hormone that we make endogenously but is often given to supplement the progress, can be used. The goal might be a vaginal delivery, but the situation can change very quickly, requiring adaptability and strategies. For example, vacuum and forceps. If used improperly, they can cause direct trauma, like skull fractures or nerve injuries. An attorney would assess if there was justification and if the procedure was executed with due care. Another one would be episiotomies. Improper or unnecessary episiotomies can lead to significant maternal injury or neonatal trauma. These can often be necessary to help a trapped baby. However, the physician has to be very careful in how and when they use that, including not to consider doing it too late. Next up, shoulder dystocia. These require rapid corrective maneuvers like a McRoberts or suprapubic pressure. Mishandling can result in brachial plexus injuries or prolonged asphyxia and those brain injuries that we've already mentioned above. Finally, of course, the decision to move to a C-section. Delays in deciding or executing an emergency cesarean section when fetal distress is evident can be catastrophic. An attorney would scrutinize the decision-making process and the speed of action. It's worthwhile taking a moment to highlight fetal heart monitoring and fetal distress. These are long, complicated rhythm strips that can indicate abnormal heart rate patterns, which signals the need for further intervention and consideration of the C-section. All of this is ultimately to prevent these hypoxic injuries. Things that we see on the fetal heart monitor are: how fast is the baby's heart rate? How variable? Does it accelerate or decelerate relative to contractions? What is the frequency of those events? Errors here include not acting timely on signs of distress, misinterpreting the data, or not employing adequate monitoring methods. Legal cases often focus on response times and the accuracy of interpretation. Even knowing what's going on, physicians and their teams still have to adhere to proper consent, necessitating both effective communication and rapid intervention to ensure a safe outcome for both mother and child. The impact of birth injuries on a child's life are profound, often requiring lifelong care. There are no shortcuts in obstetrics. Every step from prenatal care to delivery needs meticulous attention. As both a physician and an attorney, my role is not only to heal, but to ensure that the practice of medicine adheres to the proper standards of care, safeguarding patient outcomes and advancing trust in our medical system. If you have concerns, visit my website at acuitymedicallaw.com, and thanks for tuning in again this week.